I feel very honored to be able to speak to you tonight. If it looks as if I'm looking off to the side, it's because I do have some notes as an aid memoir here, because I, I have a lot to say and I want to make sure I get it in a coherent fashion in the time that I have with you. But hopefully that doesn't look too strange if I just incline my head to the left, as certainly on my camera it would be to the left. When Amel Sharif Al Fallah asked me to do this talk, I was given a fairly wide brief. But what I am going to talk about, I'm going to talk about my experiences in, I suppose, from naught to where I am now, pretty much, in the legal profession as a barrister, and also in the, what I would call in the legal profession as a barrister, in a quasi judicial role as an ombudsman, which I've had for three of those, in a former judicial role as a Crown Court recorder, and then my life as a published writer. And there is overlap with those, but it roughly falls within those areas. And then I certainly do want to talk a little bit about volunteering and mentoring, because that is something that's very dear to my heart. And I might have a few just some words of wisdom at the end, depending on how much time I have to spend with you all. I think I've reached what I would call a mountaintop age, which means that you're not old, but you're not young, but you're right at the sort of pinnacle of your intellectual abilities, your physical abilities, before things start falling apart or falling off. And you just have a real perspective on life. Someone else described it, and this is a course during lockdown that I did. I don't know how I found out about it, but it was one of those things that people did to keep themselves busy during lockdown. A woman who I've lost touch with, but I really admired, she and her husband, who sadly passed on now, wrote a book called Act 3, which is really your life between 50 and 85. Apparently, Act 1 is up until 25, Act 2 is 25 to 50, Act 3 is 50 to 85, and Act 4 is 80. Instead of life being lived in 3 acts, is lived in 4. So Act 4 is 85 onwards, which is also known as the aged old. As I have a lot of relatives on my mother's side of the family who live well into their 90s, it doesn't really seem that old to me, 85 and up, but so you have it. Well, I'm at the, if you like, the lower half of that bracket, but I'm certainly within that Act 3 period. And I do think it's a great period where you can look forward. There's still things you want to do and still things you can do, but you've got a lot of wisdom that you can share, which is what I'm hoping to do tonight. I also feel like Janus, the two-headed god that looks forward and back, after which January is called, and I feel a little bit like that. So the experiences I will give you are what I call both personal and general. So even if there's some things that are very personal to my unique experiences, I hope that you'll find that they have some broader application. And if I think about my journey, my role as a barrister, in fact, I think there is a journey to becoming a barrister. I am very proudly a child of immigrants, and I often say, and Amel Sharif Al Fallah has heard me call myself an overachieving child of immigrants, which is probably how I ended up doing all the stuff that I do. My parents are from Guyana. My father sadly passed, but my mum is still alive, and they were what they call the Windrush generation. So the Windrush generation spans between 1948 and 1971. And my mother is always at pains to tell people that she did not come over on the Windrush. She wasn't old enough to have done that journey, but they came here in the 1960s. But they certainly fall within that category. And most Guyanese parents, and so, well, I can speak for that because that's my ancestry, but I'm sure that has a wider application, are incredibly ambitious for their children. And mine were no different. I'm a Londoner born and raised, and also proudly so. And in fact, the only significant times I lived outside the UK were between the ages of 10 and 14, when I lived in Guyana, and between the summer of 2009 and January 2015, when I lived and worked in the Cayman Islands. My parents, as I said, they had very high hopes for me. It's always that thing that you want particularly if you move from one country to another. Granted that Guyana was part of the British Empire, but they still made that journey from Guyana to the UK to start a whole new life in a country which then was not hospitable for people that looked like them. But they thought, well, we might not achieve what we wanted to achieve, but we certainly want our children to do that. My father, for example, wanted to be a barrister and wasn't able, by virtue of a lot of, by the way the life was for Black people in the 60s in the UK, let's just say, he wasn't able to do that. But he was a court clerk, and he was a court clerk at the Industrial Tribunal. But he particularly wanted me, his fondest wish was for me to become a barrister. And I did that because I wanted to do it. It wasn't because of any parental pressure. But certainly the fact that he couldn't do it and I could was very much, I suppose, possibly a driving force behind that. Um, my parents, as I said, had high hopes for me. My teachers did not. In fact, one of my teachers, even when I was doing my A levels to go to university, when I told her I wanted to go to university, she said to me, no word of a lie, she said, I don't think you should go to university. And I said, really, what do you think I should do? I think you should go and work for Woolworths. And that shows how long ago it was, because Woolworths is no longer around. But that is actually what she said to me with a completely straight face. And then I think she saw the look of shock on my face. And then she said, well, if you don't want to go and work for Woolworths, you can go and become a nurse. And she didn't mean a nurse with qualifications, because back when I was sort of 16, 17, 18, you could actually leave school at 16 and become what probably now is known as a nursing assistant, but certainly you could go and become a nurse. And even though I was doing A levels, that was all that she thought that I could do. There is an upside to this, though. After I ignored her, went back and told my parents what happened, and just they said, oh, you know what you want to do, we know what you're capable of doing, and just ignore her. I was working in Croydon, which is where I was living at the time. I was working in Croydon at the end of the first year of my law degree, and she saw me in a shop, not Woolworths, but another local shop. And she came in and she came right up to me on the till. She said, I'm so glad that you found a job that was suitable to your talents. And when I told her that I was doing my law degree and I'd finished the first year, and this is just a summer job as opposed to a permanent job, she got bright red in the face, wandered off in towards the clothing section, and I never saw her again. But there is a character in my first book. There's a scene in my first book where Lee Mitchell, the central character, goes back to her old school, and the teacher in that is named after her, because it was always a wish fulfillment thing I wanted to do, to go back to my school, and I never got the chance to do it. Sadly, that was a true story that I said, both in terms of the careers advice and her reaction when she saw me working in the shop. Anyway, I did a law degree, and it was a little bit of a toss-up between doing a law degree, a psychology degree, or fashion design, because I'm fascinated by people and what makes people tick, which is useful if you're in the law, but also I have an abiding love of fashion and design, and well, it helps being a barrister and a judge with a little bit of disposable income, because then you can indulge in it in that way. But I'm very happy I became a barrister. My role to the bar was pretty standard: a degree, bar school, and then pupillage, and then a career at the bar that spanned about 16 or so years before I left. During that time, I did both crime and civil cases, but the last 5 or so years, I did what we would call heavy crime. So murders, manslaughters, big armed robberies, those kind of cases. And I did have, might sound immodest, but I must say, forgive me, one note I should say, women, we tend to apologize for things that we've done, and I've just done exactly that. I had a good reputation as a barrister, and I traveled all over England and Wales doing, particularly specializing in crime, the last 5 years of my full-time practice. The death penalty cases that I did were actually, when I was at the younger end, I think I was probably less than 5 years core when I did those. And that was mainly because I think you have to be a little bit crazy or wildly optimistic and a huge belief in your talents to take on the death penalty appeal. And I did 3 of those. I think if I were older and more experienced, it's not something, all joking aside, it's not something you take on lightly, because in the cases that I did, they were all appeals from the Commonwealth. It was either, I forget this, it was either 2 from Jamaica and 1 from Trinidad, or the other way around. But on each of those cases, if I had lost those cases, no one else was going to take them on. But so it was a choice between a rock and a hard place for them. You know, if no one else took it on, they would have received the death penalty. But and you didn't get paid for taking on those cases. But had I not succeeded, then they would have suffered the death penalty. And I think back on that, that is really the kind of enthusiasm of youth that made me do that. I'm happy to say that all three of those were successful, were commuted from life imprisonment to, I suppose, from the death penalty to life imprisonment, I should say. So because I don't believe in the death penalty, that's a personal thing for me, but I certainly wouldn't have said that any of them should have been at liberty, because it wasn't the case that they didn't do it. It was whether or not the sentence was appropriate. So I love my time at the bar, and I got good results, and I was traveling up and down the country doing lots of work, spending a lot of time in the last full year of my private practice away from home because of that. But I think I couldn't recognize this at the time, but I was getting increasingly dissatisfied and unhappy, even as I was getting the results that I was. And I later realized this was burnout. And I suppose if I was still in private practice, I would never, ever have mentioned the word burnout at all, because it was verboten then and probably still is a little bit verboten now. But towards the end of my time in private practice, I was on I've forgotten the proper name, but it was as a result of the Stephen Lawrence inquiry. They had a group to assist assist and advise the Metropolitan Police, like an independent monitoring group for that. And someone asked me to be on that. And someone that I met when I was on that group asked me if I would consider leaving private practice and becoming an ombudsman, dealing with police complaints. And the timing was right, and particularly the way that I was feeling. And so I did that. I had my first two ombudsman roles were to deal with police complaints for about 8 years in those two roles, 3 years, and then 5 years afterwards. And those were very, very challenging. I was at the IPCC at the time when Jean-Charles de Menezes was shot. It wasn't my case, but I was actually just one, the way in which it was divided up, I was just one jurisdiction up. So had he not been shot at Stockwell and had been shot just 2 stations up, it would have been my case. And it was certainly on my area, and it was all hands to the pump with that case. But so I did those cases in charge of a huge number of people that could potentially, millions of people that could potentially make complaints to the police, including Heathrow Airport, Gatwick Airport, Dover Port. So there were a lot of cases to do with immigration sort of jurisdiction cases as well. And then I left that job and got a role, applied for and got a role in the Cayman Islands as the Complaints Commissioner for the Cayman Islands. And this was a job that I applied for at the time when I parted company with the IPCC, not in a good way for my boss, because he behaved incredibly badly. So I did leave there, no blemish on my career, but it was as if he hadn't behaved so badly, I might have stayed longer. And during the time that I was trying to work out what next to do, I saw the job in the Cayman Islands advertised. And I had a friend who had she had interviewed for the Attorney General's role in the British Virgin Islands. And I knew that they flew her husband, and her 2 kids out for a week to see if they liked the BVI. And I thought, well, I'm not planning to leave the UK, but I know that I could do this job. So if I get down to the final 2 or 3 or whatever it is, then they'll fly me out to the Cayman Islands and I could do with a free holiday, and that would be really nice. So I did get down to what it turned out to be a long list of 4, 99. I know afterwards 99 people applied. There was a long list of 4, a short list of 2, and they did fly me out, but I was flown out for the grand total of a day and a half. And I was interviewed for the whole day. I had half a day to wander around and decide what I was going to do. And at that particular time, I thought, well, there's no reason why I shouldn't take this job. And if I don't like it, I can always leave. And so I accepted it, and I left in the summer of 2009 to go and take up the job in the Cayman Islands. Ironically, when I came back from my interview, I had applied for my judicial position. I came back from my interview, and half an hour later, no word of a lie, the postman walked up the path with the letter from the Ministry of Justice. And it was a very thin, flat-looking letter. And I thought, oh, gosh, well, I didn't get through. It's my first time, but, I didn't get through. I'll try again. So I opened it. They said I'd gotten through to the next stage, which was really lovely. I was not expecting that, literally 45 minutes, half an hour to 45 minutes after I arrived home. But I'll come on to my judicial appointment later. I was in the Cayman Islands from August of 2009 to January 2015, an amazing experience. It that's to talk about that as a whole talk on its own. So I certainly won't be doing that because I know how we're running out of time and the lights are going off. So, but it was a fantastic experience. And then when I was in the Cayman Islands, someone recommended that I apply for the Service Complaints Ombudsman for the Armed Forces in the UK. And there will be those of you who will remember, no doubt, Deep Cut and what happened with the three young servicemen and one young servicewoman, all in their late teens, very early 20s, who, it is said, took their own lives at Deep Cut barracks. And as a result of that, it took a long time to set the office up, but it was as a direct result of that. They had a first iteration of that office, which wasn't very effective. And the second iteration had its own investigators. And someone suggested that I apply for it. And almost on a bet, I said, all right, I will apply for it if you promise to give me a reference. I didn't think, I thought I could do it, but I wasn't sure that the UK defence is not necessarily known for being particularly progressive. And I didn't think that I would be considered. I was actually interviewed 5 stages, and one stage was to appear before the House of Commons Defence Committee to be grilled by them before appointment, and I was subsequently appointed. And at the time that I held that role from 2015 to 2020, I was the highest ranking person of colour in the whole of UK defence worldwide. I had the equivalent rank of a 3-star general and the equivalent civil service rank of a director general. So I did that for 6 years. The first year was a transition year, 2015, from the old order to the new order, and then the following 5 years as the Service Complaints Ombudsman. Incredibly interesting job. I never thought I would have been so interested in all things defence, and I still am interested in all things defence as a result of that. So that was, if you like, my middle role before I came to the judiciary. So those are quasi-judicial roles. And then my judicial role, I got that appointment roughly about the same time as I got the appointment to go and work in the Cayman Islands. And I didn't want to turn one down for the other, but I worked out then what I could do is sit the absolute minimum days, because back then you only had to sit 15 days a year, which is ridiculous actually, because it is very low, but it worked out for me. So I thought if I did that, it's effectively 3 weeks a year, and I could come back to the UK once every 4 months, because everyone said, as beautiful as Cayman is, it's very small, and excuse the inelegant expression, but people are always up in your business. That's what someone actually told me. It is, at the time, the population was 50 to 55,000. I know it's significantly more than that. And that is the smallest place I've ever lived in. And Georgetown, the capital, was only 25,000 people. So even Caymanians said, you have to get off the rock every quarter, every 4 months. So that was a perfect opportunity for me to come back to the UK, to sit and see family and get a bit of decompression. So I was appointed in 2009, October 2009. And I heard my first case and my swearing in was the sort of spring, summer 2010. And that was a bittersweet moment, because my father, who was always very, very keen and always following my progress, had actually been quite ill the last couple of years of his life, but not ill to dying. And sadly, he died just before he knew that I got the appointment, but he died before he could see me getting sworn in. And I know that he would have absolutely loved to have seen that. He absolutely would. And there are a lot of things that have happened since. When I became a bencher at Lincoln's Inn, and when my book launches, both of them were at Lincoln's Inn itself, I thought, this is the library where I studied as a student, and this is the library where my dad studied, and he would absolutely have loved all of this, actually. But I still believe that in some way he knows. That's my personal beliefs. So my time at the judiciary since 2010, when I did my first cases, I combined that with the 5 years that I was in the Cayman Islands, and even when I was in defence, I combined it with that, but upping the days that I sat. And I absolutely loved it. And now, ever since 2020, I have been sitting an awful lot more, because it's one, I love doing it. Secondly, it combines very well with my writing career, which I'll now come on to. My first book was Without Prejudice, And this is at a point when I wish I had some books I could do a bit of a show and tell, but I don't have those. But if you go on Amazon, you can see them. Um, my first book initially came out the very back end of the 90s when I was still in private practice. And then I had a 2-book deal then. And both times when I got published, the first time and the second time, was so miraculous that miraculous is the only way to describe them. Again, that's a longer discussion, but if there was a question about that, I can talk about that. But I wrote between midnight and 4 in the morning when I was in full-time private practice. So I was for a year, I survived on 4 hours sleep a night. And I think that was one of the reasons why I didn't write again for well over 20 years. The idea of doing that again, I just couldn't face it. I also think it's something that you can do when you're younger, survive for a protracted period of time, but not when you're older. You can't do that, or at least I couldn't. And then I was rediscovered by Bernardine Evaristo and as a result of that, my first book was republished in 2021, and I got a 2-book deal from Penguin, and my second 2 books were published in 23 and 25. And I have ideas for at least another 4 books. 3 of them will be on legal thrillers. One is about a Black historical character from the 1700s that I'm amazed that nobody knows about, but I want to write about that. So that's my publishing. And I feel a little bit of a novice in publishing, not the creative side, but the whole business side of publishing is a whole other story. And one of my books has been optioned for, the screen rights have been optioned. So we'll see whether something comes of that. And just finally, with volunteering and mentoring, I really believe in this. It might make me sound like some soppy hippie or whatever, but I'm a big believer in giving back. One of the things I love is to go into schools and people about, I suppose, my journey as a lawyer, and to encourage them in my journey, because they might look at me as, and maybe in some cases, I'm a South London girl who went to I did go to a private school in Guyana, but I went to a regular state school in England, and I was able to do it. And I always say, if I can do it, you can absolutely do it yourselves as well. So I volunteer for Speakers for School. I would absolutely, and it applies to anybody on this call, if there is a school you want me to do that, because I get so much pleasure out of it. And my volunteering is usually with other things that are not school related. I'm big into film, and I always volunteer for the Free Film Festival in my area. And I used to sing in the choir, but I don't do that anymore. But certainly, excuse me, certainly volunteering and mentoring would lead me on to my concluding remarks, is that if I was going to give any advice to anyone, advice to my younger self or advice to people that are on here, please keep whatever makes you, you. The law makes you change in some ways, or it can. I mean, and it's not a criticism, that's just the way that it is. Excuse me, and I have to take a drink of water in a minute. I always say it should be a bit like water. Water can change from liquid to ice, but it never forgets its essential nature. So even if you have to adapt to where you are, code switch, some people would say, remember what makes you, you, and hang on to that, particularly in a demanding profession like the law, because you need to have that. It's very easy to lose your way if you don't do that. And it also protects you against burnout. So learn from my mistake with regards to that.